In 1959, Liberace stood in a British courtroom and swore on his mother's life that he was not gay. A newspaper had suggested otherwise, and he was utterly incensed by it. So he sued them for libel, and he won, walking away with damages and a formal apology, while the jury, which had watched this rhinestone-covered, candelabra-obsessed, fur coat-wearing man perform his outrage with considerable conviction, apparently found him entirely believable. The whole of Britain applauded him for having the courage to defend his honor. He went home to America and continued living with his secret lover. He had been gay his entire life, and he had spent decades making sure nobody could prove it. And the most spectacular, flamboyant, aggressively unsubtle entertainer in the history of television had somehow convinced an entire courtroom that he was a perfectly ordinary heterosexual man who had been viciously wronged. He died of AIDS in 1987 and told nobody until it was far too late to matter. What came out after his death was the biggest bombshell of all. Liberace was, by almost any measure, the most commercially successful pianist who ever lived. Not the most critically acclaimed, not the most technically gifted, though he was genuinely extraordinarily talented, and anyone who has ever dismissed him as a novelty act has made a considerable mistake. But in terms of raw commercial dominance, in terms of filling venues and selling records and making more money from a single performance than most classical musicians would see in a decade, nobody came close to Biagio Valentino Liberace, who grew up in Wisconsin in a deeply modest household, the son of a concert musician father who was largely absent, and a deeply devoted mother who believed with absolute conviction that her son was destined for something remarkable. She was not wrong. By the early 1950s, Liberace had his own television show and was performing to audiences of tens of millions, which was a genuinely staggering reach for a pianist in an era when rock and roll was beginning to devour everything around it. He understood instinctively that performance was not just about the music, but about the experience. And so, he gave his audiences an experience they had never remotely encountered before. The candelabras on the piano, the matching rhinestone suits, the grand gestures and the warm smile, and the way he talked to the camera as though he was speaking personally to each and every person watching at home. His audience, which skewed heavily toward older women who had grown up with classical music and found rock and roll utterly baffling, was utterly devoted to him in a way that bordered on the religious. What none of them knew, and what Liberace worked with extraordinary diligence to ensure they never found out, was who he actually was when the camera stopped rolling. Liberace had known he was gay since he was a young man, and he had known with equal certainty that his audience, the older, conservative, deeply traditional women who packed his concerts and watched his television show and bought his records, would not forgive him for it. This was not a paranoid assumption. This was an accurate reading of the cultural reality of mid-century America, where homosexuality was not merely stigmatized, but actively criminalized in most states, where careers had been destroyed and lives had been ruined by exactly the kind of exposure Liberace was desperate to avoid. And so, he built a performance around the secret that was so audacious, so outrageously over the top, that it somehow functioned as its own cover. The rhinestones and the fur coats and the candelabras were so flagrantly, almost defiantly camp, that the people who might have suspected the truth apparently found it easier to believe that he was simply eccentric rather than reach the obvious conclusion. He talked about his mother constantly and adoringly in interviews. He was photographed with women. He spoke warmly about marriage and family. The image was constructed with a meticulous care that never quite looked like construction. Behind it, he had relationships with men that he managed with considerable discretion, until a young man named Scott Thorson walked into his life and made discretion considerably more complicated. Scott Thorson was 17 years old when he met Liberace in 1977. Liberace was 57. Thorson was working as a driver's assistant and had been brought backstage after one of Liberace's Las Vegas performances by a mutual acquaintance. And Liberace, who was utterly captivated by him, almost immediately began pursuing him with the same single-minded determination he applied to everything else in his life. Within weeks, Thorson had moved into Liberace's home in Las Vegas. Within months, he was being described publicly as Liberace's assistant and companion, a cover story that satisfied the press and the public while bearing almost no resemblance to the actual nature of the relationship. What Liberace did next revealed something deeply controlling about the man beneath the rhinestones. He told Thorson that he wanted to adopt him legally, to make him his son on paper, which would have provided a convenient explanation for their closeness that required no further examination. When that plan fell through, he arranged for Thorson to undergo plastic surgery instead, to have his face altered to more closely resemble Liberace's own features, as though he was attempting to literally recreate Thorson in his own image. Thorson was a teenager. He agreed to the surgery. They lived together for 5 years. Thorson was given money and cars and jewelry and a lifestyle that was, by any standard, extraordinary. He was also given drugs, first to manage his weight at Liberace's insistence, and then increasingly as a way of managing the relationship itself, which had become, by Thorson's account, deeply claustrophobic and at times genuinely frightening. When Liberace ended the relationship in 1982, he did so abruptly and without apparent remorse, cutting off the financial support and essentially ejecting Thorson from the life he had spent 5 years building around a man who had pursued him when he was 17 years old. Scott Thorson sued Liberace for palimony in 1982, and the lawsuit became one of the most sensational legal stories in America that year. Not because palimony cases were unusual, but because of what this particular case implied about the man at the center of it. Liberace's legal team denied everything with a ferocity that left the courtroom genuinely taken aback. They described Thorson as a troubled young man making desperate and fabricated claims against a blameless entertainer who had generously employed him and been viciously repaid for his kindness. They denied that any romantic relationship had ever existed. They denied all of it. The case was eventually selected out of court for a sum reported to be in the region of $95,000, accompanied by a silence agreement that Thorson signed and largely adhered to for several years. Liberace returned to Las Vegas and continued performing to his devoted audiences as though none of it had happened, which in the context of his public image, it largely had not, because the press coverage of the lawsuit had been remarkably restrained, and the conclusion most of his fans appeared to draw was that a troubled former employee had made unfounded claims against a generous man and been appropriately dealt with. The rumors continued. Liberace ignored them with a composure that was either genuinely admirable or deeply troubling, depending on how you choose to look at it, and continued giving interviews about his devotion to his mother and the love of cooking, and his passion for collecting antiques, and his audience continued to adore him, and the secret stayed exactly where he needed it to stay. By the mid-1980s, people close to Liberace were beginning to notice that something was wrong. He had lost weight. His energy, which had always been his most reliable professional asset, was visibly diminished. He cancelled appearances and gave vague explanations, and his management staunchly refused to engage with any questions about his health, which in the context of 1985 and 1986, when the AIDS crisis was devastating the gay community in America, and the disease had become one of the most politically charged subjects in the country, was itself a kind of answer. Liberace was diagnosed with HIV, and he told almost nobody. He continued performing. He continued giving interviews. He continued maintaining the image that had sustained him for 4 decades. And when journalists began asking directly about his health, he denied everything with the same practiced composure he had brought to denying everything else. His doctor, who was aware of the diagnosis, later faced serious professional consequences for having helped Liberace conceal it. He died in February 1987 at his home in Palm Springs. He was 67 years old. His manager initially told the press he had died of heart failure related to anemia. The Riverside County coroner conducted an autopsy, determined the actual cause of death, and released the findings publicly. Liberace had died of complications from AIDS. The secret he had spent his entire life protecting with such extraordinary, relentless effort had outlasted him by approximately 2 weeks. Scott Thorson published his memoir, Behind the Candelabra, in 1988. It described everything: the relationship, the plastic surgery, the drugs, the controlling behavior, the abrupt ending. All of it laid out in specific and at times deeply uncomfortable detail. Hollywood made it into a film in 2013 with Michael Douglas playing Liberace and Matt Damon as Thorson. And it won 5 Emmy Awards and introduced the whole story to a generation that had been too young to remember the original headlines. The women who had packed Liberace's concerts and watched his television show and defended him furiously against the rumors were mostly gone by then. The ones who remained had largely made their peace with the revelation in the way that people do when someone they genuinely loved turns out to have been someone other than who they presented themselves as. With a complicated mixture of grief and forgiveness, and a lingering sadness for the man who had felt so utterly unable to simply be himself. Liberace was buried in a private ceremony in Las Vegas. His grave is marked simply with his name. No rhinestones, no candelabra, just a name he was born with: Razio Valentino Liberace, the boy from Wisconsin who became the most flamboyant entertainer in the world and spent every single day of his adult life desperately afraid that the world would find out why. If the story stayed with you, a thumbs up helps more people find it. And subscribe if you want more stories about the distance between who people were and who the world was allowed to see. Because Liberace was very far from the only one.